Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Energy Capital Podcast. I'm really excited to have Tiffany Wu here to talk more about what all is happening in ERCOT, particularly around SB6, large loads, transmission cost allocation, all of the hot topics right now. Tiffany Wu is an energy markets and regulatory consultant with McAdams Energy Group. And for more background with McAdams Energy Group, you can go back and listen to Matt Baum's interview with Will McAdams just a couple months ago. So before working at McAdams Energy Group, Tiffany was a DOE Solar Energy Innovation Fellow and also an advisor to Will McAdams while he was a commissioner at the Public Utility Commission of Texas. But between that, also was a senior project manager at TEPRI with the Texas Energy Poverty Research Institute, which is, I think we actually met. We had our first conversation when you were at TEPRI, and I was asking you questions about how these 9.9 megawatt batteries, what they were paying for electricity and how much they got paid for electricity, because that was a big deal for a while.
That's right. Yeah, I remember that there were a lot of questions around whether or not those batteries, which support the grid, whether or not we should be paying for some of those distribution level costs as transmission level costs. Yes.
Yeah. Anyways, we probably won't get into that, but we can leave that as a thing. But that was super helpful back then. Thanks. And I know you also spent 10 years with Mitsubishi Heavy Industries as a process engineer, commissioning engineer. I'm really excited to have another engineer on this podcast. That's kind of rare, to be honest.
Well, thank you.
You got your BS in chemical engineering at UT Austin before getting your master's at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. So Tiffany Wu, welcome to the Energy Capital Podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So the day we're recording this podcast, we just released a podcast with Eric Goff where we hit on some broad topics around how ERCOT policy is made. We talked a lot about the large load process. I'd encourage folks to kind of maybe listen to that podcast first in terms of like kind of setting the broader goal. But with this one, I think I'd like to get a little bit deeper in this conversation around some of the intricacies of the process, kind of where it's at. And to be fair, this kind of fits in my teaching philosophy of anytime I give a lecture, I try to say the same thing 3 times in 3 different ways as a way of like, some people learn one way versus the other way. So there will be some overlap between this and the podcast with Eric, but I still think there's so much there that I think we need to be having a lot of conversations around this. But we're going to get deeper into some of these things, but let's start bigger picture, maybe for folks who haven't heard the one with Eric. So the whole reason we're having this conversation about large loads and batch zero and transmission cost allocations based on SB6 or Senate Bill 6. Can you lay out what problems Senate Bill 6 was looking to solve and kind of how the batch zero process, fits into that effort?
Yeah, sure. So Senate Bill 6 is trying to balance a few different things. So previously in ERCOT, most of the large loads were coming from the cryptocurrency industry. It wasn't until recently that more of the data centers have been looking for interconnection into ERCOT. So historically, the way that you would connect into the system is you would go and talk to your transmission provider or your distribution provider and ask them, hey, I want to set up a business. Can I connect to the electricity system? And they would figure it out. Historically, they were working on one project at a time, and TSPs were conducting the studies. But ERCOT started to see that there may be a reliability issue with how many loads are coming onto the system and how big each of these loads are. The other issue is that with the cryptocurrency miners, you may remember that a lot of people were worried that they were not paying transmission costs because the way that we pay transmission costs historically is based off of the 4 coincident peaks during the summertime. And so if you're able to avoid that, then you don't have to pay transmission costs. So in SB6, what they're trying to do is provide more guidance and more standardization around how you interconnect into the system. So that would support business development. And on the other side, they're also trying to make sure that whoever does come into the system will pay their fair share of the interconnection costs.
Yeah, no, totally. So there is that distinction in SB6, and I know there's this distinction of like 75 megawatts and above that defines kind of the large load. And I know the Public Utility Commission can change that number in the future, I think, if they want. Where did that number come from? Do we have a feel for kind of where that 75 megawatts came from?
I'm honestly not sure where 75 megawatts specifically came from, but I think that what they're trying to do is make sure that this is capturing the data center loads, which we know are
Yeah.
potentially like hundreds of megawatts to gigawatts to even multi gigawatts now,
Yeah.
versus some of the traditional loads that are like the oil and gas industry, petrochemicals, manufacturing. So not making it more burdensome for those traditional loads to interconnect into the system still.
Yeah.
But PUC did try to reduce that threshold to 25 megawatts. They're allowed to reduce the threshold if they think that it's necessary.
Hmm.
They originally wanted 25 megawatts for the load forecasting rulemaking, but that was going to capture so many things and that was going to be so burdensome that multiple people pushed back against that.
Got it. When the 75 megawatts like threshold kind of came out, a lot of people said, "Well, we're just going to see a bunch of 74.9 megawatt, data centers show up." Are there any of those? Are we seeing a bunch of those pop up under the radar now? Or I guess maybe we're not seeing them. Do you know if they're there?
I think they are there, and I don't know for certain, but ERCOT had posted or filed a graph of load forecasts recently,
Okay.
and it had two bar graphs next to each other for multiple years, and there was a huge gap between them. And the bigger gap does include those medium loads that are less than 75 megawatt, but still fairly significant. So I am curious how much of that just wasn't covered because we've been so focused on all of these larger than 75 megawatt loads.
So the latest numbers that ERCOT put out are around, like, of large loads. Got my cheat sheet up here too because the numbers keep changing. Is 445 gigawatts. So is there even more than that number? Given that like these smaller, just under the 75 megawatt threshold?
I think that the 445 gigawatt number that you're talking about is the number of large loads that are trying to interconnect into the system, right? So that's the number that would be included in batches because there's a portion of that, about 330 megawatts that likely won't be included in batch zero, but want to interconnect.
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, anything that's less than 75 megawatts is not going to get captured from that table chart.
Oh, interesting. So these numbers that I've been making fun of and saying I don't believe, like, they're even bigger, possibly out there.
Possibly. I don't know. I wish that I knew.
I mean, in my head, it might as well be a million. I think Eric put it well. He's like, it's just the number's just infinite, right? Because we're not going to be able to connect all of this, and so like the numbers just might as well be infinite. Okay, well that's interesting slash terrifying, but we'll see like kind of where where we go. All right, so let's get to the batch zero process. So the batch zero process is kind of like, how we're potentially going to try to clear this backlog and connect these large loads. Now, I think before we hit record, I said, hey, the batch zero is not finalized, but then you said actually it kind of is. So why don't we just say, what is the status of batch zero? It was recently tabled to the June meeting, but can anything change between now and then, or is it pretty locked in?
Oh, so yeah, so it has to work through the stakeholder process. So it's been approved through the PRS and ROS. And yesterday was the Technical Advisory Committee meeting, TAC meeting.
Okay.
And that's when the stakeholders voted on batch zero.
Okay.
And leading up to that, there have still been a number of requests to change certain parts of batch zero, and ERCOT was pretty resistant against any changes,
Hmm.
which makes sense because we're getting up on the deadline. There was a move to try to have an alternate revision request language, but that was shot down. Only 30% of stakeholders approved that alternative. Then they brought up the ERCOT
Mhm.
revision request, and that got 100% approval.
Okay, and so did anything change in the TAC meeting the other day, or did it just get kind of approved there?
No, nothing changed at
Okay,
TAC. Well, the latest revision was from May 18th.
right.
Basically, a new revision has been coming out every few days for the last few weeks, I feel like.
Okay,
And at the end of this, ERCOT was pretty resistant to even like small changes. And so that's what's been approved. So next, it will move to the board of directors meeting, and that's scheduled for June 1st.
okay.
And once they approve, which I assume they will approve, the revision request, then the PUC has to approve it.
Okay, so hopefully all the research I did on batch zero this weekend still holds as we talk about it.
Welcome to my life.
Yeah, no. I'm just here to cosplay. So I want to get into some of the stages of kind of the batch zero concept. So there's like 5 steps as far as like I understand. And tell me if anything that I say has actually been changed because I didn't check yesterday. Maybe I should have. So the first step is like, okay, figuring out how much load actually gets into batch zero. How much are we going to study? The first step is like the inclusion criteria. So which large load projects are going to be included? So what do we know about what these are? Do we have a feel for kind of like how is ERCOT going to say which projects are in batch zero and which projects are not?
Mhm. And there's two categories within batch zero too. So there's the base load, and then there's going to be the studied and allocated loads.
Okay.
What ERCOT has been saying is that the only thing that they know is whether or not the transmission service providers have filed studies for those loads and whether or not ERCOT has approved those studies. That's the basis of which ERCOT is using to approve specific loads for either base or batch zero, or you just didn't make it at all.
So base load here, the term base load is used in electricity in a bunch of different ways. But in this specific case for batch zero, so are these projects that went through the previous way of getting large load connected? Like they went directly to the TSP and they got the study and they're just now they're good to go, but they just need to be included?
Yeah, so there's history there.
Okay.
So last year, there were multiple pathways to be interconnected into ERCOT.
Okay.
So one was the original way, which was you work with your transmission service provider, and then they do an RPG process. They go through the RPG process, which they study the loads that are necessary and the transmission projects necessary to support specific loads within a specific region. That was one pathway. The other pathway was because ERCOT was now transitioning to also approving large loads. That's called the large load interim process. And so they created a process to review those TSP analyses. And I'm not an electrical engineer, but there's certain studies, steady state study,
None of us are. No, just kidding.
stability study, short circuit ratio study that they have to do for each of those loads. And so if a load went through that process by a certain time, then they were approved for base load. And they also had to sign an interconnection agreement with the utility as well. So it was two things, whether or not you were approved through the ERCOT large load interconnection process and you got a interconnection agreement with the utility, basically. What's giving some people heartburn and was part of a lot of the controversy leading up to the TAC vote is that the other process,
Mhm.
some utilities were telling their customers, we need new transmission in order to serve your load. So we need to go through the RPG process. And so they told those loads, hold on, let's not do the large load interconnection process. Let's go through the transmission process.
Oh.
Yeah. So that was totally okay until, I guess, December 15th when they transitioned to a large load interconnection study, the LLIS process, which is also known as PIGR 115. It was approved December 14th or December 15th. And I don't think it was clear even at that point that going through the RPG process was going to be enough to get you interconnected.
Okay. That is quite a bit of backstory on some of these. I mean, I know some of these loads are valuing a megawatt not connected for a year in the billions of dollars or whatever, or a gigawatt not connected in the billions of dollars. So these are, I guess, loads that are being grandfathered in, but they're not currently connected to the system. So ERCOT's got to study them as if they're coming online. And then there's like the studied and allocated load. And these are the loads that have not been approved just yet, but are try to work their way through the batch zero process. Is that right?
Yeah. So first, from ERCOT's perspective, they were looking at two specific things for being eligible to be considered baseload, right? It was whether or not you were approved, the studies were approved, and if you had an interconnection agreement by a certain time frame. But the PUC also had criteria that were given to them by SB6, which includes financial obligations, site control, whether or not you're trying to interconnect at another location and developing a different project, whether or not you're bringing backup generation and all these things. So there are other things that the loads are going to have to attest to. And that I think it's in July, they're going to have to provide that information. The biggest open question right now is the financial obligations that will get you into base load eligible. And then another thing that you mentioned for the base load, they have an agreement in place. So their utilities already told them, like, we're going to be able to give you this much power by this time frame. And there's like a certain schedule. So they're going to be studied based off of that schedule. And then those that don't meet all of the criteria to be included in base load, but are included and studied and allocated, they will be allocated a certain amount of additional load within the 5 to 6 year transmission planning process that's going to be evaluated as part of batch zero.
Okay. All right. So we got to figure out who gets in. That's contentious. None of this is going to make everyone happy, right? But this is just the way it is. I mean, when we had Pablo Vegas on the podcast, he basically said, like, we're going to have to figure out something. We'll tweak it as we go, but like, we got to do something. It's probably the case that if, like, not everyone's happy, that it's probably a hashed out process. And I won't make you comment on that. But so step 2.
Yeah.
All right. So like,
yeah. Who are the winners and losers?
yeah, but it's like the electricity sector can only move so fast. I mean, it's real steel in the ground that's got to go. Okay, so we got inclusion criteria, who's going to get in, and then they're going to do the batch zero study, which I presume is like a big electrical engineering stability, like we're going to run some power flow models to figure out like what is it going to take to get all of these loads connected. Is that right? Did I get the second step right?
Yeah, that's right. And before we get there is a financial obligation for you to get into batch zero. So you have to pay a $50,000 per megawatt financial security. Not pay, sorry, post a $50,000 per megawatt financial security. And that's before they perform any study, right? But in the PUC rule right now, there's a possibility that after they run the first initial batch study processes that you're not going to get a very good allocation. So then you'll get to choose whether or not you want to move on to the next steps. So in the first step, it's going to be studying all of the loads together, the steady state analysis and the stability screening. And then the ERCOT's going to have to work with all the TSPs. There's going to be a lot of back and forth between them. Also, for just a plug, if anybody wants to work on this, ERCOT just said they're hiring like so many FTEs for this. So any electrical engineers out there?
Okay.
Yeah. So they're going to do the studies. At the end of the studies, you'll know what you're allocated, and then you'll get to decide whether or not you want to stay in the process.
The third step is they're calling it the commitment gate. So in the second part, they do the electrical engineering studies that you said. Maybe you're only getting so much load per year, right? Maybe you want 500, but you can only get a couple hundred per year, maybe. Do you know how far out that process is going? Like if they're going to allocate a certain amount, are we looking 5 years out? Like how far is this process?
Yeah. So originally they were thinking that they would be looking 5 years, and then in the 6th year, magically you would just have all of the transmission that you need. But now they're working on something else that is considering all 6 years. And I don't think
Okay.
they've decided yet how they're going to figure out that allocation yet.
Okay. So there's 5, 6 years, something like that. We're going to look forward. And then I guess like if you like your deal, if you like what you get out of the study, then there's like this commitment gate. So what does that commitment gate look like? So you've posted 50K per megawatt. Does that mean that like you push that into escrow? Like how do you say yes to the commitment gate?
Yeah. So that's a big unknown right now.
Okay.
Yeah. So great question. Everybody's asking that. So the PUC is working on rulemaking for interconnection standards, project
Okay.
number 58481. And the latest proposal for publication for that was filed March 12th.
Okay.
So that was the last, I would say, official guidance from the commission on where that rule might go. And in that proposal for publication, there were 2 agreements that you would sign. One is the intermediate agreement that you would have to sign and post the $50,000 per megawatt financial security before the start of batch zero.
Okay.
And then at the financial commitment point, you would have to sign an interconnection agreement, and you would have to pay. Then the $50,000 per megawatt financial security becomes a fee. So that's a cash payment of $50,000 per megawatt, plus what we call a contribution in aid of construction, kayak, which pays for the specific equipment that gets you connected to the transmission system. So it's just what we call the driveway.
Yeah. The gen tie, if we were talking about generators, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that was in the March 12th proposal for publication. If you ended up backing out at the financial commitment deadline,
Mm-hmm.
only 20% of that $50,000 per megawatt would have been refundable. So you basically gave, it's a big financial commitment. So staff had been getting a lot of feedback from stakeholders. Like, that is a huge risk, right? We don't know anything at that, especially think about like future batches. At least in this case, a number of these large loads that are going to be in batch zero have already done some amount of studies.
Right.
But in future batches, they're going to be coming in for the first time and they would have to post that. So PUC staff did provide some guidance as part of PIGRA 145 and the interconnection process, but it hasn't been written into the rulemaking and it's not included in PIGRA 145. And so we're still kind of in no man's land around how this is all going to work.
Okay, but we're still voting on this thing in like a month, right? So it's like,
yeah. Yeah. So what we're voting on for PIGRA 145 is just that you have to post a financial security.
okay.
But how much of it is refundable? What happens if you don't get your full allocation?
Yeah.
None of that is detailed.
Right. So we're voting on the process, but there's still ongoing rulemaking and discussions and stakeholder and putting the meat on the bones of the process, as it were.
Right. But you're still putting a lot of capital at risk by doing it this way, right? It's basically like,
Sure.
yeah.
Well, I mean, when you've got 434, whatever, a million megawatts, trying to connect to the system, you got to separate out the wheat from the chaff somehow, I guess. But that is a lot. That's fair. If you're only getting 20% of that back, I mean, that's, you're anteing up 40K per megawatt. If I'm doing the math right in my head. I can see how that would be a hard pill to swallow.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Okay, so that's step 3, commitment gate.
Yeah.
So step 4 is basically, okay, so commitment gate, we see what clears, and then I guess it sounds like we redo the study we did in step 2, but now with just the loads that have cleared the commitment gate, which would have to be equal to or less, I guess.
Correct. Yes. And part of the reason why we're going down the batch process method instead of doing the serial study process, which we had been going through, is because the serial process, if you got on before or somebody else got on before you did, you'd have to get restudied. And so the hope is that after we go through the financial obligation gate and there's only so many loads left over for the batch refinement period, that this is not a full restudy because otherwise we're just codifying restudies, but instead it is an actual refinement period of just like, okay, those loads went away. So the transmission projects are likely going to be more like this.
Okay. All right. So in step 4, we study the loads that make it through the commitment gate. And then, maybe all of the upgrades that were identified in step 2, maybe we only need a certain percentage of those because there's presumably potentially fewer loads in the refinement study. But then there's actually a plan that's sent out to the regional planning group or RPG to say, this is the transmission that we need to build to support this much load. And I think one of the things that Eric mentioned in the podcast was like, this is a new thing than the previous ways, because the previous ways said like, it's possible to build this transmission, but there's never a plan that was created. And so is that the whole reason for this thing, is to get that plan to RPG to be able to build?
Yeah, so before there were so many different pathways to do this, but just stick to one. So let's say that you went through the LLIS process and the transmission provider told you that you were able to energize within a certain time frame and you're going to need that, like transmission project A to get to 200 megawatts, transmission project B to get to 400 megawatts, and so on. So you'd be like, okay, cool, great. Maybe at the same time, that utility would be going through the RPG project to get those transmission projects approved. So they could either be going sequentially or concurrently, which also goes back to like the controversy around who should be included in batch zero, because for the ones who went through the large load process, they were studied, but there was no transmission project behind it. And then for the projects that went through the RPG project, they have transmission projects, but they weren't studied one by ERCOT.
Okay. I got a few questions. Say that it gets approved at the next meeting and this process kicks off. I know there's some rulemaking that has to flesh it out as it goes, build the airplane as it's flying, but like, how long does it take to get to, here's a plan, RPG? How long does this process take, presuming that it gets approved, for the first batch to go through?
From start until you know the results of the RPG.
Yeah, but what is the hope, anyways, of how long this take? Are we talking 6 months? Are we talking a year? Are we talking 5 years? Like, what? How long is this batch zero process going to take?
Yeah, it kind of depends on how they study years 5 and 6. Like, how detailed are they going to get around the transmission projects? Are they going to try to study like a ton of different transmission projects, or is it just what's reasonable? That all takes time, so it could extend, depending on like the amount of studies and projects that they need to work through, it could extend the process another month or so, month or two. So right now, the schedule is, if we had only just thought like, okay, we'll study for 5 years, and then in year 6, magically, you have all of the transmission that you need. July was going to be the start of batch zero, and then it would be completed, like the RPG comment period and board approval would be in September. But if we're doing more analysis around the future years for transmission projects, then that could extend into December of next year.
Wait, December of 27?
December of 27.
Okay. That's a pretty big delta between like 2 months or.
Oh, no, sorry. Maybe that was confusing. It was either going to be September 2027 or it's December 2027.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I thought you meant it was they're going to figure this out over this summer. And I was like, wow, that's fast. Okay, that makes way more sense. I could just hear all the computers like running all the dynamic simulations in my head. All right. So we're never going to get off this first question, which is great.
Yeah.
All right. So it's going to take, I mean, we're looking at mid to the end of 2027. Do we have a feel for how much load is going to make it in the study? Like as base load or as like studied and allocated load? Do we have a feel for how much load's going to get in the front of this?
Right now, it's looking like the maximum amount that would be base load is around 30 gigawatts.
Okay.
And then the amount that would be in a studied load would be about like 90 gigawatts.
Okay.
So in total, 130.
130. But then if we got a 5 or 6 year process and we're kind of spreading that up. Okay, so this feels better than the chart with like the 435 gigawatts by like 2030 or whatever. So that's great. But ERCOT is also going to create a couple of different kind of potential, I guess, ways you can do this. There's this thing called the provisional controllable load resource, which ERCOT has these controllable load resources that can bid their load into SCED, the same program that makes generators go up and down, can make load go up and down. But there's also the ability of these loads to say, I'm willing to be a provisional controllable load resource. Can you kind of walk me through like what is that and what would be the advantage of doing that for these loads going into the batch zero process?
Yeah, so there's two potential pathways. One is the provisional controllable load resource, PCLR, or there's what they're calling the withdrawal limited private use network, WLPUN, and that's basically if they're bringing their own generation.
That's the BYOG. That's the other. Okay, yeah. Okay. Yeah, there's two, right?
Yes, there's two. Saying that you're a PCLR or a WLPUN is not going to get you into the batch process faster. You still have to meet all of those other requirements that we had talked about.
Okay.
But what being a PCLR or WLPUN helps with is that, let's say the transmission provider tells you you're only getting 100 megawatts in year 1. You could say, like, could I actually get 150 megawatts? And in tight periods, I promise to come down to 100 megawatts. Or
okay,
on the bring your own generation, it might just be like, okay, my net use from the grid is going to be that amount, but I still have my own generation. So it's just a way for them to increase the amount of energy that they can use on a timeline that's more business friendly.
Yeah, totally. One way is like I'm willing to like let some of my load be curtailed, or I'm going to bring my own generation and make it up from that on the other side. It seems like no one likes either of those, and they really want this third option called like a netted network. But ERCOT is saying that it's kind of not feasible for the batch zero because it my understanding of the netted network process, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, is that you still have like the limited point of interconnection. So you still have like a 100 megawatt limit, but you have load and generation behind that point of interconnection. But both of those things can fully play in the ERCOT market. You can be a CLR and have generation that can maybe get ancillary service revenues or other types of things. Because my understanding that these other ones, these PCLRs and the provisional controllable load resources, the BYOG pun type thing, you do not have access to the ancillary service markets, but people want that. Am I getting that right?
So that's beyond what I know at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's fair. It's like this is coming off of some slides that I was kind of looking at and just talking to some folks in the space. They're like,
Yeah.
this is kind of what we want to do. This is where we want to get to. It's my understanding that ERCOT says like, yeah, maybe we'll get to that. That sounds great. But like,
Yeah, for them right now, it's one or the other. And that's something that they did clarify is you have to choose. Basically, are you WL PUN or are you a PCLR?
yeah, we've talked about batch zero for like a while. And so we have a study process. It's either we're going to get through it by September 27 or December 27, depending on how we decide to study like the latter years of that. Then it's going to take a while to build this transmission. We're going to have the plan, but then, it may take 4 or 5 years to build out that transmission. I guess it's probably too early to say like how much transmission that's going to be. I mean, that would be the result of this whole thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yes. What do I want to say about that?
I'm putting you on the spot, like, admittedly. So it's like, you don't have to have an answer for that because I sure as heck don't. Like,
No, I do want to say something about it. So, a question around the batch process and why you wouldn't just allow every load that wants to be in it to be studied is because there's a limited amount of transmission that will be able to be built. And I think that the transmission service providers probably have the best idea around what they need, what's possible, what could be the potential routes. After the RPG process, a lot of these transmission projects are likely going to need permits. They're going to have to go through the CCN process at the commission to finalize what the routing is ultimately going to be. And so that will dictate what the final cost will be and which transmission projects are actually going to get approved and built. So, yeah, there's still a lot to do after this batch process.
the commission's getting a lot of experience right now on routing of transmission with all the 765 stuff going on. Those are some of those dockets are chock full of things.
Can I just say something about the 765 kV lines? So I think some senators sent a letter to the PUC recently asking them whether or not all of the 765 kV lines are even necessary for the Permian Basin reliability plan. So I do think there is a risk that if there's too much discussion, and there has to be the right amount of discussion around like what's a real load, what's not a real load, how far are we constraining the batch zero process? Like the reason why we need transmission is for these loads. There has to be a balance for that.
I mean, we've built, transmission for load in ERCOT while other regions have built it for generation or and load, we've always built. I mean, pulling that thread a little bit though, but the 765 like lines, like they predated a lot of this AI data center boom and other types of things, right? I mean, I remember that S&P study that came out about electrification of oil and gas in like the Permian and Delaware basins. I mean, it was blowing everyone's mind that we were going to get 10 gigawatts of growth, and now that would feel nice. It feels like if that were all. Am I getting that right?
It is so strange how fast the industry is moving right now because you are right that it was mostly the oil and gas industry that was pushing the transmission need in the Permian Basin region. And I think even within the industry, they were questioning whether or not 765 kV lines were necessary because in Texas, we've only gone up to 345 kV lines. But the benefit of the 765 kV line is that eventually we're going to want a backbone of electric highway, basically, right? So
Yeah.
that was just the first step. But I think the ultimate plan was to connect all of Texas with these 765 lines.
No, totally. I mean, I think like, and it was this thing that Eric said on the podcast last time is like, the nice thing about 765 is you actually need fewer lines. If we were just stuck with the 345 and we had all this load, like that would be more lines and more routes and more dockets. All right. So a little tangent there, but like is also a thing going on. It's my fault. Okay. So we talked a lot about batch zero, but batch zero presumes that there's a batch one
Yes.
or a batch next process. So is there any coalescing on like, or thought about, does that look similar? Does it look different? Like what would be different about post batch zero?
Yeah, we need to talk about batch 1 or batch N, whatever we want to.
We don't even know what we're going to name it,
Yeah,
right? Like yeah, we should come
exactly.
up with something.
And actually, they're going to be talking about it tomorrow. So I don't know when this is going to get posted, but at the May 21st LLWG meeting is when ERCOT will be presenting a framework, I think, for what batch 1 will look like. I think it will be very similar to batch 0. And I think they're going to have to make some tweaks, though. I hope they're friendlier to some tweaks of the criteria for inclusion, since batch 1 won't get started until I think the spring of 2027 or something like that. So there's time to make that a nice policy.
Do you want to expand on that? What do you think would be a better approach for batch one or batch N or batch next, or I don't know what we're going to call it?
Yeah. I think that with batch 1, there was a lot of confusion around the LLIS process and the RPG process. I think with batch 1, they'll need to talk about what do we do with RPG and the other transmission planning process, the regional transmission plan, RTP. How did those two conventional transmission planning processes work with the fact that we're going towards studying large loads or any load in batches going forward? There needs to be consideration for that. So I think hopefully there will be less confusion then, since we're talking about the policy for the future rather than building the plane as we're in it. So yeah, so I think that that'll be a big piece. The other thing is I hope we'll know what financial obligations are required to get into future batches. By that point, right now, those rules are still being written when we're trying to get batch 0 started. So it's just kind of messy, confused time right now. So there's time to make batch 1 clear.
Sure. Again, that's what Pablo said is like, we're going to do something, we're going to move forward. You know, it's not going to make everyone happy, but we'll tweak it as we go. I think I reference that podcast a whole bunch every time I talk to folks. All right. So also part of SB6 was it told the PUC that, hey, you need to study the transmission cost like allocation issue. This whole thing with batch 0 on connecting all of this load is like, we got to figure out how much transmission we're going to build, where it's going to go, because that's what we need to do. And well, we're just going to let the market worry about generation, but we need the transmission right now. So right now we allocate the cost of transmission with 4 coincident peak. We're discussing how that may change. Tell me about 4CP, what the issue is, why are we looking to study it, and what should we be paying attention to?
Sure. Yeah. So historically, transmission infrastructure is based on the maximum potential size of the amount of electricity that we would use at any given point. So if you think about a pipe, it's like, what's your maximum flow rate through that, right? But everybody is using electricity at different times. So I'm not necessarily switching on my dryer the same time that you are. And it's the same thing with industrial loads. Like there's going to be moments when they use a lot of electricity and moments when they don't.
I've got a 1-year-old at home, so the dryer's always on because we're just like, anyway, there's always dirty clothes. Anyways,
There's always something
sorry.
to be cleaned. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe not you. You are.
I'm base load dryer.
Yeah, you're 100% capacity factor. So in the summertime, that's when in Texas we've historically hit our peak, right? Everybody has their air conditioning on. The cooling towers are probably going crazy. Everybody's at work. People are, I don't know, going to camp. I don't know. Whatever else requires a lot of energy during the summertime. Probably mostly air conditioning.
It's air conditioning, yeah.
Yeah, it's air conditioning. Yeah. But with 4CP, what we do is we look at who was a transmission customer during the summertime. And in those 4 15-minute periods that were at the highest use across the system, what percentage can be associated with each customer? And then that's how we allocate transmission costs for the next year.
Mhm.
And so for industrial customers that are transmission customers, they could be reducing the amount of their electricity demand if they can forecast when they think that's going to be. So a lot of the steel mills do this. They just don't run their arc furnace during those times, for example, to reduce their percentage requirement. I think it became a huge issue because of the crypto miners. And I think Eric talked about this too. Like they could just shut off, right? It's not like you're producing anything that can't just be shut off like that. And so they were able to avoid their transmission costs. But residential customers, we don't have the option in competitive areas to avoid 4CP. And so we end up paying for the transmission cost based off of our energy use, and it doesn't matter what time we're using electricity. So that's part of the reason why they're thinking about shifting from 4CP is to make it harder for people to avoid the transmission costs.
Yeah.
But there's a trade-off because the point of the demand response is to reduce that peak load so that you don't need as much infrastructure. They're thinking about going to 12 CP with 30 minutes. And I think that there's going to be discussion around whether or not that is the right call. But what is more impactful in the transmission cost allocation policy discussion is that the commission staff is proposing that rather than chasing these coincident peaks, the large loads are going to be charged based off of their contracted peak capacity. So if they're going to come in at 100 megawatt, or they want 100 megawatts at any point of time, then that's what the basis of the transmission cost is going to be. Even if in the summertime they could like reduce down to 50 megawatts or something like that. So it almost makes like the demand response piece of it completely evaporate.
Yeah, I wonder if there will be some kind of hybrid approach. Before maybe I try to pull that thread, do we know what it would look like for like a PCLR or these other? Because like a PCLR, going back to the batch, we can't get out of the batch zero process, but like if you have 100 megawatts, but you can flex above that if like the grid's not stressed. So maybe you can actually pull in 150, but the grid's under stress and they're like, you got to crank it down to 100. Do you know if they'd be charged on that 100 or the 150?
So a PCLR is a temporary, so it's just to allow you to use electricity above your allocation until you have transmission built to your site. So your contracted capacity, like say for a large load that is 200 megawatts in size,
Yeah.
and you're only going to be allocated 100 megawatts, and you say, I'm a PCLR, can I use 200 megawatts sometimes? I think that you're still going to be charged at the 200 megawatts,
Okay.
but that rule's not written yet, so it's possible it may be different, but that's how I expect it would go.
Okay. And so would the transmission cost allocation change for everybody, or is it going to just be different for the loads that are above 75 megawatts?
So for the change from 4CP to 12CP, that's going to change for everybody. But the minimum transmission charge, I think, will only be for the large loads.
Okay. And I think Eric was talking about there potentially also could be like the minimum transmission charge could even be a fraction of what your contracted is. So it could be 50%, 75%. I'm assuming that will be a number that will be highly contested and argued over.
Yeah, so in the interconnection standard rulemaking, I think there was a range between 50% to 80% as the minimum. So
Hmm.
if you only used 40% of the demand during coincident peak, you would still have to be charged 50%. If you used more than that, then it would just be based off of the coincident peak. But it's basically like setting a minimum for the transmission charge.
Okay, so if the minimum transmission charge was like 100% of your allocation, then there's no reason to try to do any 4CP demand reduction. But if it's like 50%, or well, if it's below 100%, then there would still be some, maybe not as much as it has been in the past, but there would still be some incentive to do some DR.
Yes, exactly. And the other thing is that the reason why they want the minimum transmission charge is so that the large loads will pay for their portion of the transmission system that they're causing to be upgraded. Right now, in the 58481 rule, which is the interconnection standard rule that I had mentioned, there's the intermediate agreement and then the interconnection agreement, and that $50,000 per megawatt becomes a fee.
Okay.
The purpose of the $50,000 per megawatt fee, I think, was also to make sure that the large loads pay their fair share of the transmission system.
Yeah.
So if they're going to be considering a minimum transmission charge going forward, then likely they don't need the interconnection fee then, because then you'd be paying upfront and you'd be paying after you've connected as well for, I think, the same thing. So they're going to have to work through that.
Okay. Or would it also maybe just be a difference in how much would be refunded? I guess like,
It could be, yeah, yeah. There's so many ways that this could go, right? And you brought up a good point. The 50% to 100%, that's going to be heavily contested or debated. One of the other aspects of this is that the transmission cost allocation proposed language might require that minimum transmission charge for 15 years, the first 15 years that the large load is in operation. The number of years will also be negotiated
you're right.
or debated.
Okay, yeah, there's a I can see why this framework of this is going to be, I mean, likely approved, and then we'll really see how the sausage is made as it goes down. Okay, we talked about SB6, batch zero, transmission cost allocation. Is there anything else going on at ERCOT? What else do you do? I mean, with all your time.
Yeah, there are other things that are going on. You brought up resource adequacy earlier, and you were like, oh, yeah, the markets is going to deal with that. But actually, this year is the first year that we're going to be performing the reliability standard study.
Yeah,
And so the load forecast is going to matter. How much are we going to be planning for?
right.
So the reliability study is there to determine the probability of an outage, right? So we're looking at how many resources, how many generation resources do we have, and how much demand do we have, how much demand response do we have, all of those things. And so the assumptions really matter. And so what they have decided is to wait until batch zero process kicks off so that they can use that as the load forecast for the reliability standard.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm a consulting firm. Ideasmith is an independent market registered entity, and I got that notice from ERCOT the other day. It's like, we're not going to put out our assessment because we're going to wait to figure out like how much load that goes in this. So, okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Yep. And at the end of the reliability standard, the PUC and ERCOT may decide that we need additional market changes in order to meet the reliability standard that Texas has set.
Yeah.
So more changes to come.
More changes to come. I mean, we're not the only grid that's looking to change things. I know BJM just put out a big white paper on some big changes they may make too. They're the other grid that's also dealing with a lot of load growth in Data Center Alley and other places like that. But the numbers feel bigger in Texas. I mean, everything's bigger in Texas, but we're figuring it out, right? At least we're going through the process. So
Yeah, the good thing is we can move fast. We're innovative. Everybody knows each other for better or worse. So
is it better or worse? Which one?
yeah, the rest of the country will be able to learn from our successes and mistakes.
Yeah, totally. Awesome. Well, Tiffany Wu, thank you for coming on the Energy Capital Podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Energy Capital Podcast. If today's conversation helped you make better sense of how the energy system actually works, share the episode with a colleague and hit follow on your podcast app. You can find us on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and all the usual platforms. For deeper analysis and context each week, subscribe to the Texas Energy Empower at texasenergyempower.com. That's where you'll find every episode, every article, and our latest updates. We're also on LinkedIn, X, and YouTube, where we share clips, insights, and ongoing commentary on energy policy, markets, and the grid. Before we go, a quick note. The views expressed on this podcast are my own and do not represent the official positions of the University of Texas, Ideasmith, Austin Energy, or Columbia University. A big thanks to Nate Peavy, our producer. I'm Joshua Rhodes. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.